Hi, I hope that you all have dug into the readings for this week 3 on freedom. Um, Freedom is a word that I feel like we throw about a lot in our culture without ever really digging into what we mean by it. And so this week's readings are intended to do that in the context of education. Um, and as such, I think that they will challenge, or already have, since it's Wednesday, and I usually do these after your comprehension assessments. I'm doing it a little bit early this week just because I know some folks were struggling with the readings. But what I was saying in the sentence before is that I think that this set of readings um, will really push you both to see the connections across them and to really pinpoint why it is that we need to talk about freedom in education, right? So before I dig in, I want to remind us that the question this week is freedom in education possible? And then I really want to remind us of Freire's work. So we have read chapters 1 and 2 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Where Freire makes this argument about the fundamentally oppressive nature of traditional schooling, of banking. And he offers us a way to move toward liberation, away from oppression and toward liberation, through a problem posing approach, a co-generative process of meaning making. If we have that at the back of our mind as we look at this week's readings, I think that they'll make a little more sense. So if we're talking about freedom in education, we're asking this question, is freedom in education possible? The flip side of that is, why isn't there freedom in education now? Right? And so in some ways, Freire in the past 2 weeks has answered that question for us, or offered us an answer to that question, and has explained how and why oppression runs through traditional structures of schooling and learning, as did James Baldwin. I'm blanking on all the authors right now, but many of them, right, have talked about this. Oh, the First People's Principles of Learning, Rietenberg talks about it. A lot of the different readings have gotten at this idea that there is something in schooling that is often fundamentally oppressive. Okay, if that's our given, then we have to figure out why. And so that's why we start with the Nyberg article about power. Because if we're going to understand how oppression is flowing and why freedom is or is not possible, we need to consider this idea of power. Now, Nyberg gives this great, thoughtful, detailed analysis of power and how it flows in schools. But I'm going to break power down to a really easy way to remember sort of 3 different directions that power can flow. Power can be over, which is often what happens in schools, right? That teachers have power over students. We're in control. You can have power with. We're together in solidarity and collaboration. You have power together. Or you can have power to. And we can think about that as agency, or one's sense of efficacy, right? Having power to affect something, power to make change, power to do something. It's power over, which is like force, power with, which is collaboration, and power to, which is about efficacy. Okay, so if you can remember that power flows in 3 ways. We don't read any Foucault in this class. If you were a grad student in education, you would. But Foucault, like Bourdieu, sociologists, French theorists, remind us that power is not inherently bad. That typically when we talk about power, we use it to mean power over. But power is not inherently bad. Power with and power to can be really desirable forms of power and can in fact instigate social change and less hierarchical, less oppressive relationships. So really thinking about power and where and how it flows is important. And that's what Nyberg offers us, in addition to forcing us to wrestle with this idea that someone can't have power over you without your consent. That's a challenging idea, because I am sure that we can all think of instances where someone has exerted power over us, but we didn't consent, right? No way. I don't consent to this. I don't want this. I don't. And so Nyberg lays out these 4 ways that we can get consent from someone. And the first is really important because it's by force. And so it's not that I'm willingly giving consent, it's that I am forced to give consent, right? So he's not talking about legal consent, which is something very different. He's talking about getting someone to go along with your power over them. They have to stop fighting it in order for you to have that power over them. And so in schools, we can do this by force, right? We have rules, we have suspensions, we have discipline. We could also do it through fiction, through stories and narratives that we tell about why it's important to consent to a power structure. He uses the word finance, but he's not necessarily talking about money. He means that we make trades or trade-offs for consent. If you consent to my power over you in a school, you will have access to better education later. You will have access to better paying jobs. You will get an award. You will get a good grade. Those are all forms of finance, or sort of bartering or offering trade-offs or payments or what have you. So it's sort of, instead of force, instead of punishing people, you're buying in many ways their consent. And then the last is through fealty, a fancy way of saying through relationships, through trust, through respect, through mutualism, that we consent to power over. And I would say that this is the one that is most in line with how we think of consent, right? That I am saying yes, I am willingly, not because you're bribing me, not because you're forcing me, not because I'm believing a story, but because I'm willingly in relationship with you and allowing you to exercise power over me. Okay? And remember, Nyberg's talking about power over. Okay. Why do we have to pay attention to these forms of power in schools? Because power over, particularly in relation to force, fiction, and finance, I'm going to sneeze, probably, sorry. Power over is the mechanism by which schools exert their oppressive forces. It is how schools act oppressively, as Freire says. So we have to understand what's happening there. And if you were to step back from philosophy, and if you were to look at a lot of educational research that's trying to figure out how to interrupt oppressive structures in education, it really is looking at these 4 categories, right? Force. How do we interrupt this? How do we interrupt, for example, the school to prison pipeline? Fiction, right? Exposing things like myths of meritocracy. Finance, right? Thinking about the currency and the capital that's afforded based on schooling. And then fealty, really thinking about how do we develop mutual relationships. Okay, so that was a long explanation for power. I'm going to go much more quickly through the other 4 readings, but it really lays a foundation for thinking about, if we're striving for freedom in education, we've got to work against these forces of power, or shift from power over to power with or power to. Okay. So the next 4 readings are all ways of thinking about that. Of thinking about freedom, or liberation is a word that a lot of the authors use, which is going to call to mind, again, Freire's idea of oppression, also notions of justice, right? That we're not just talking about like these authors in particular. We could talk about freedom in a lot of different ways, but these authors are specifically talking about freedom from power over, freedom from oppressive power structures. So hooks is really applicable to thinking about both the student and the teacher. And she's making an argument that regardless of the structure in which it occurs, that intellectual work, theorizing, trying to make sense out of the world, why it is the way that it is liberating. That it can be liberating. Being able to name your reality, being able to theorize it is liberating, particularly if you have been living within oppressive structures that you don't consent to, that you bristle against. Being able to name those oppressive structures and say, oh, this is what's going on. Oh, right? So Freire talks about literacy and moving from just talking about, like, here's how you read the word cat, to asking questions about the world that we're in and then trying to make sense out of them collectively together. And particularly when doing that with folks who have been marginalized or oppressed or made vulnerable, there's a power in naming the world and theorizing it. Now, Hooks goes on about in different communities, like she talks specifically about the African American community and how theorizing can be looked down upon. She talks about anti-intellectualism. All of this is to say it's called theory as liberatory praxis or liberatory practice. I can't remember which word she uses in the title. She uses praxis in the body of the piece to remind us that theory, so it's liberating, making sense of the world can be liberating, both in terms of freeing one's inner self, right? And being able to name what you live in. But if it only stays in the realm of the head, of the internal, well, that's important. Hooks is pointing us towards, and then we act in the world, right? That how we act in the world should be influenced by this theorizing that we do. So for Hooks, theorizing is liberating for the individual. And then when the individual acts on that, when the individual uses that theory to change the reality in which one lives, it becomes liberating more broadly. It becomes a force for social change. It becomes a force for pushing against oppressive structures. But that first piece is theorizing, is naming the world, naming one's reality. Okay, Stenberg is really writing from a teacher's perspective. So Stenberg is writing about liberation theology and liberatory pedagogy. If you read this piece, you know that Stenberg talks a lot about Freire, and Freire as a kind of liberatory pedagogy. Freire is also referred to as critical pedagogy. But a couple points here that I want to point out in Stenberg. And let me backtrack for a second. Hooks is really showing us how theory can help us have power too, to understand why someone has power over us or why a system has, and then through theory we begin to develop power too. That's the liberatory practice. Stenberg is really pushing us to think about power with in a pedagogical relationship, the role of the teacher, specifically around the idea of moral, ethical, justice-oriented liberation, right? And that means liberation from oppression. Specifically, the point that I want to highlight in the Stenberg piece is around that liberatory practice, teaching, acting in the world, depends upon those of us who typically have power over, either because of our social positioning, because of our career as teachers, right? That we, not out in the whole world, in our classroom, right? So that we grant epistemic privilege to the oppressed. Now, we learned about epistemology last week, so this word should be a little less daunting. Epistemic privilege means that we prioritize more the ways of knowing of people who have been oppressed. Now, for those of you who are philosophers and theologians, you will recognize that Stenberg is showing us how this idea comes from the gospel, right? How it's the foundation of liberation theology, which is rooted in the gospel. that's why I include this piece here. So you may be like, this is a little out there compared to some of the other philosophies, but I want you to see that there are different ways of thinking about philosophy in relation to education. And Stenberg is offering us a philosophical analysis, but also a theological one, helping us to understand how certain pedagogical moves, right, of rejecting power over, granting epistemic privilege. And if you have power over, that means that you have to actively relinquish power over. And one way of relinquishing power over is to privilege or prioritize the ways of knowing of those who have been marginalized or oppressed or made vulnerable. And that this becomes a way of then creating a relationship in the classroom where you can share power, where you can have power with, where you can act in solidarity or in accompaniment with those who are working against oppressive structures. Okay? I'm going to flip to my next page of notes. One idea that comes up from Stenberg, from Hooks, also from Freire, is this idea that the antithesis of power over isn't freedom. The antithesis or the opposite of power over is love. I'm just going to plant that there and let you think about that, because that's going to come up again in all of our remaining weeks, this idea of love and what is its role in the classroom in resisting oppressive structures, in cultivating freedom and liberation for our students, in moving us towards greater knowledge of the world. What is the role of love? Okay, so the fourth piece by Patel is short and sweet, so I hope you like that's a short one. Here, Patel is really talking about the learner. So remember, Hooks has got us thinking about the learner and the teacher. Stenberg has us thinking about the teacher. Patel is now focused on the learner. And Patel makes this claim that learning, real learning, is a fugitive act. And so what Patel is offering us is a way of thinking about learning as resistance. And the question that I would raise is resistance necessarily freedom? Is resistance necessarily liberation? Is resistance just taking away consent, power over? Or is it allowing us to have power with? Is it allowing us to have power to? Is it imagining something new? What's at stake here in these acts of resistance, these fugitive acts of learning? Also, this idea of survivance, which comes from, as she writes about, I think it's Gerald Visner, an indigenous writer and scholar, this idea that Indian survivance is not just about survival, and it's not just about resistance, it's something more, and that more is survivance. And that survival and resistance are interwoven in a kind of a new way of being, right? Is that freedom and liberation? That's something to think about. Learning as a fugitive act also is in part about no longer consenting by any of these ways to you having power over my learning, my intellect, my sense making, and that I'm reclaiming this for myself. And in so doing, I can take away my consent from all of the oppressive structures of school. And what would that look like? What would be the purpose of schooling then? Stenberg gives us a little bit of idea about this when she also talks about the prophetic leader, that in liberation theology and liberatory pedagogies, while there is epistemic privilege to the oppressed or the person who has power wielded over them, there is still a role for a teacher or a leader. So what would that look like? Okay, the last piece by Gloria Anzaldúa, who's a poet, an educator, a scholar, a philosopher, Chicana, as you get her, how she identifies, right? There's, at a really basic level, in How to Tame a Wild Tongue, she is making this argument that silencing one's language, silencing one's way of making sense and expressing that sense is oppressive, right? That is the crux of oppression related to difference in schools. And she hints throughout at what freedom might be. That when a wild tongue is allowed to speak, right? When our wildness, our language, our identity, our wholeness, our family, our places of being, when all of our wildness is invited into sense making and changes that sense making, then that becomes an act of freedom. Each of these readings is meant to challenge you to not think about freedom in a one-dimensional way in schools, but to think about what would it take to shift power structures, not only away from traditional forms of oppression, but in ways that might lead to liberation. And is that possible in schooling and education as we know it? Okay, I hope that helps. For those of you that are waiting for this video to do your comprehension assessment, I hope this helps. For those of you that have already done it, I hope it clarifies and enables you to enter into the discussions and the film analysis, having a little clearer idea of if you're on the right track. Okay.